Brian, you turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks. And not having been on the trip, unfortunately, basically my comments will have to do with my perceptions of the environmental progress and lack thereof in China compared to the United States, and some of the implications of our policies that we have, especially in light of the perception by some that China is leading the way. We ought to be emulating what they're doing. My experience has largely been based on what I've seen and read, and graduate students that I've had the fortune to advise who are from China, in recognizing the dire situation that many exist in China, because they don't have the large protections that we have. They've not made the progress that we've made, that have led to us having, while if you read the papers, it seems that we still have these huge environmental challenges. If you dig a little deeper and look at the numbers, you see that we've made considerable progress, and that we are leaps and bounds ahead of where we were even in the last 30 to 40 years. We've had significant advances in air, water quality, and we continue to have ways of doing that using capitalism, using the creativeness that can spark. We've been able to do that in a way that allows the economy to continue to improve our standard of living, which is something I think that we sort of miss out on when you compare what China has. When you look at some of the great monuments they have, the airports, and some of the things that you can point to and say, look at the technology that's involved there, is you have to ask at what cost. When you see how that's borne by the numerous population and those that have so little and that are forgotten and lost in that system that operates. And we have, while we certainly do still have those who we would like to raise the standard of living for, we have those issues we continue to deal with, we are far ahead of what we see in a lot of other countries. And so we're fortunate from that standpoint. I think if you look at the infrastructure that China has been investing in to build the electric generation, for example, that they need to continue to take over more and more of the manufacturing throughout that occurs in the world, is you see that a lot of that has been borne on the backs of those of us who are trying to either, we don't want to have that pollution here, we can't politically afford to have that, or you look at what the Kyoto Protocol did, where European countries were buying offsets from China, where they were basically paying China to create supposedly more efficient generation plants. And so there's a lot of disconnects when you look at the impacts of the international goals we've had. And as we look at a lot of the momentum with regard to greenhouse gas regulations, suggesting that we need to be proactive so that we can be the center of the green technology. You use those terms where we look at the new energy sources that need to be here, and if we don't do these things like cap and trade, or we don't regulate greenhouse gases through the EPA's applying the Clean Air Act, that we're going to miss that opportunity. When I think in actuality the opposite is probably true. If we really cut the legs out from under our economy by suggesting that we're going to force an abandonment of some of our natural resources, the coal, the natural gas, and the other fossil fuels, we aren't going to be able to as quickly advance to those new technologies that will allow for cleaner, more efficient new technologies to develop better carbon sequestration, for example, that we can use in enhanced oil recovery, where we can invest in through tax incentives and through other types of incentives, the development of algae-based fuel production, or looking at developing a new technology where we can have, instead of using corn and other fuel feed sources as our primary ethanol source, if we can conquer and overcome the challenges with cellulosic ethanol production, where we can turn some of our marginal lands into productive lands, but that also protect the environment and help us to have greater energy independence at home. Those things are opportunities I think we'll miss if we follow through with the approach that we have to turn our backs on the energy and the natural resources that we have today and say we're going to make it so expensive to do that will force the development of these new technologies. I think if we take that approach, we can't afford the capital investment that's necessary, especially in these economic times, that would be required to get us where we want to be in a faster manner. And I think if you look at the approach that Texas has had, we've actually seen advances in finding ways to incentivize developing those new energy sources, cleaner ways of burning the coal and the natural gas and other sources of fuel that we have. And so I think that it seems like it's been very eye-opening for you. I wish I could have been on that same trip to really put in a face-to-face visit those things that I've seen and heard from colleagues and others that have seen it, and it isn't the panacea that it is sometimes touted to be.
Mike and Derek, before you move to the questions, one of the things that none of the three of us mentioned, which I think was the first thing that we noticed, the first thing that we saw. And on the first day we were there, we went to the Great Wall of China, and the sky was absolutely wonderful. It was beautiful. Second day, and most of the time thereafter, when you were looking at that slideshow, those weren't pictures that were out of focus. That was smog. I went to college in Los Angeles, you know, for 7 years between undergrad and law school, and had spent some time in Pittsburgh during the time when obviously smog was horrible in Pittsburgh. I've been to Mexico City 3 times in the last couple of years. I've never seen smog like we saw in Beijing and Shanghai. I mean, and that was the purpose for us going on this trip, to see what they were doing. This is a place where the American Embassy actually said while we were there that they had smog that was crazy bad. Now, when you use a hip-hop language to talk about this, you know something's up. You know, the Chinese government itself has what they call blue sky days. And they count the number of days when they can see the blue sky. We spoke with a gentleman on one of the latter days who was running a technology firm, sort of a private, it has a franchise, if you will, with the Chinese government, but a private firm. And he says that he didn't see, that there are people in Beijing who did not see a blue sky until right before the Olympics, when they shut down factories so they would not have the emissions. So that was one of the first things. And one of the things that I also mentioned, in terms of why I thought the question about efficiency was so extremely important, as Barry mentioned, we saw buildings that were beautiful, and we built tall, big, but mostly empty, not even finished on the inside. Because that kind of economy structure will lead to waste, because it cannot allocate resources in the same kind of efficient way that the market will do so. But in that regard, also talking about efficiency, I found it to be interesting when we went to CNOC. And you're sitting there with, admittedly not the largest, but the third largest of the 3 oil producing companies. And the gentleman was talking about the need that they may have for CO2 EOR, Steve. And they don't have any naturally occurring source of CO2 in the country. But he hasn't spoken to any of the power gens who are producing CO2. And I was reflecting upon our first exercise when we developed FutureGen, and many of you remember, I said we were going to win FutureGen, but if we didn't, we were going to do FutureGen Texas style. And one of the ways of doing that was to put mining companies and power gens and producers all on that team and say, what is the value proposition you can bring to this? One of the reasons I think that we'll get there first is that there is a private incentive, there's a market incentive to go make things happen. And here's a guy who needs CO2, who's never had a conversation with the 2 other people that we saw on our trip who are producing CO2. And said, how can I get some of that CO2 that you're emitting? We saw a fabulous capture facility that somebody might be capturing. How can I get some of that? Because somebody above them hasn't said you guys need to talk to each other. But here in our process, those folks would get together because they see that there's value. He's got a commodity over here that he needs in order to produce more crude.
You know, really, Brian, it was not an eye-opening experience, it was an eye-watering
And there wasn't a dry eye in the house.